States reflected the economic and political stalemate over which groups in the U.S. would bear the burden for the relative decline in the economic and political hegemony of the United States. Ultimately, for there to be a way out of stagflation, the economy needs to grow more rapidly, and the claims being placed on economic output would need to be brought more in line with the available goods and services. But in 1980, it was not totally clear how this was going to happen. Whose claims would bear the brunt of the adjustment? The stagflation was broken in the 80s, and while not explicitly discussed in these terms, the Reagan administration attempted to create a new institutional framework for economic prosperity based, in some people's minds, on neoliberalism, that term, and other people use the term deregulation. Employer strategy and government policy were closely aligned, focused on eliminating labor market rigidities, thereby fostering labor market flexibility. Government deregulatory policies weakened the minimal social protection policies already in place. Union power was reduced through government policy and aggressive anti-union management behavior, resulting in sharp trade union decline. Increased employer unilateralism within the 1980s, political economic context entailed a cost-cutting, particularly labor cost strategy for many. Labor standards declined, the wage structure was lowered, wage inequality grew, as did the amount of low-wage employment. Job security became more widespread, and the burden for the relative decline of the U.S. and the world economy was borne by those workers, both organized and unorganized, with weakened bargaining power and by the poor. The prolonged economic expansion of the 1990s, and it was long. It may not have been high, but it was long. The prolonged economic expansion of the 90s was built on the emergent neoliberal framework. Deunionization continued apace, thereby enabling greater employer freedom in setting pay and personnel policies. Wage gains lagged productivity increases, and there was a further polarization of income and collective bargaining results. There was a spread of contingent forms of employment and contingent forms of pay. And the increasing presence of contingent employment fostered job insecurity, as did corporate downsizing in the face of strong profitability and a strong economy. Productivity growth was fueled by investments in information technology and by the intensification of work effort, the latter based on workers' security. Government, economic, and social policy was more contested in the 90s, and there was some evidence for a slightly better social policy in some ways, a higher minimum wage, an improved employment tax credit for low-wage workers. And on the other hand, there was welfare reform, which essentially ended the welfare system as we know it, and pushed a lot of people into the low-wage sector of the labor market. By the end of the 1990s, in the second half of the expansion, you saw a diminishment in economic inequality. You did see an improvement in real wages, based on an increase in minimum wage and higher aggregate levels of employment and lower levels of unemployment. The economy goes into a short recession, and when the expansion starts again, once again, increased economic inequality and stagnant real wages. So once again, the legacy of the 1980s restructuring remains. So, the conservative free market restructuring of the economy, the ascendancy of business, the deunionization of the private sector, and the overall growth of inequality and insecurity all point to the following question. Are neoliberalism, deunionization, and labor flexibility components of the new social structure of accumulation? The analysis in this paper is based on a book that I wrote called American Economic Development since 1945. That part of the title is not controversial. This is the second part of the title, and it goes like this. Growth, decline, and rejuvenation. And it's that last phrase, and rejuvenation, that has got me plastered right away. In the views of the book, they like it. And the rest of it, they like it. And on the right, the fact that I said something critical about neoliberalism is plastered on the right. But it's just what can you do? Okay. Well, in the book itself, I don't use the term social structures of accumulation. So in a sense, I feel like an interloper in this events there. On the other hand, I think the analysis that is present there has influenced my thinking for the book. Okay, so I think I have a place to begin. In the time that's remaining, there isn't that much time, but I'll go through it. I'll walk you very quickly through this, and then we'll have more time for discussion. So all you have to say, I think, is more important than I have to say. You can read the papers, so go right ahead. Okay, fine. The neoliberal governmental policy regime of the 1980s. Okay. Seeking to reverse the economic decline in the 1970s, raise the average rate of profit, and improve the overall productive efficiency of the economy, the Reagan administration pursued a policy agenda designed to restructure the economy by freeing up market forces. Ideologically, the federal government was attacked as the most important cause of the economic problem. To some degree, a socio-political regulation of the labor market was replaced by market forces. Essentially, the idea was to knock the profs out from under workers and to expose them to the brunt of competition. However, in terms of the dating issue, and there has been a discussion of the dating issue here. When did things start and when did they end? While we say that Reagan started this, in fact, it began under the Carter administration. Okay. And in the years of 78, 79, what you can see under the Carter administration was the following. There was the appointment of Paul Volcker to the head of the Federal Reserve, and the implementation of monetarism. Behind the veil of monetarism was actually an attack on workers. And it was designed to lower inflation by raising unemployment, and boy, that began the process. Secondly, you can see under Carter that they began to tax unemployment insurance. First time. You can see under Carter there was a program whereby you could have unemployment insurance for 65 weeks. They gutted it. And so the beginnings of the attack on the social wage wasn't Reagan. It was actually under Carter. While Carter tried to improve welfare for people, welfare system, by the end of the administration they were talking about cutting back on aid to families with dependent children. And the deregulation of business, which Victor Lippert talked about before, the cost of data and so forth like that, the first discussions of cutting back on the regulations was actually under Carter and not under Reagan. And the discussion about the cost of regulation that Victor talked about favorably, Bill Taft, he wouldn't say it, but he wrote a very good article in Challenge magazine gutting that whole discussion of the cost of these regulations. So you can actually see the roots of the neoliberalism in the Reagan period that actually began under Carter. Okay, fine. All right. The Reagan period. Okay. The push for labor market efficiency via deregulation represents a decline in labor standards. What they do. The effective minimum wage was declined. How? For 8 years, the longest time in history, the minimum wage stayed safe. No increase. Okay. Second, unemployment insurance was reduced, as was aid to families with dependent children. Public service employment programs were cut. And the government policies aimed at introducing a more competitive mode of regulation of the labor market served to weaken unions, and governmental industrial relations policies setting a union-busting tone did exactly the same. Okay. You can read about the increased unemployment that occurred in the recession of 81-82. That's clear. What people may not know is it was centered in mining, manufacturing, and construction, just those areas where labor was the strongest, just those areas. And so in December of 1982, the unemployment rate reached 23% in the car industry, 29% in primary metals, steel. I mean, these are levels not experienced in the U.S. And boy, it had an effect. So I'm not saying they consciously aimed it at the sectors, no. But the effect of the higher unemployment was felt in just those sectors where labor was the strongest. Okay. Decline in minimum wage, clear. Unemployment insurance cutbacks, ending public employment, and sending those people in the labor market. Clear. Welfare reform, and so forth. What people may not know is often, and here was mentioned, Reagan fired the air traffic controllers. And that sent a message to employers. You can fire your workers too if they go on strike. See, in the U.S., you can't legally fire your workers if they go on strike. But you can permanently replace them. We can discuss that at another moment in time. And so that sent a message to employers. You can, in fact, do it too. And you can, that was fine. What most people don't know about is that there were many decisions of the National Labor Relations Board that made it much harder for laborers to organize, and if they were organized and have contracts, much more difficult to get your demands met at the bargain table. Combined the deregulatory government policy with managerial strategies and deunionization in the 80s, and see what took place in the collective bargain. It's a premise of those working within a social structure of accumulation framework that a central component of the post-war institutional framework is the capital labor accord. And what I might say here might get me disinvited from this session. I'm not sure an accord was ever signed. I'm not sure a truce was ever reached. And perhaps it's language that's the issue. But what I would say is that while it's the case that unions and many corporations accepted the legal boundaries of collective bargaining set by the Wagner Act and the National Labor Relations Act, thank you, serious conflict did not disappear. Employers initially chose to live with unions where they were, and 35% of the workforce was unionized in 1955. 35%. And the private sector was even higher than that. Today it's 8%. But serious conflict did not disappear, and in the late 1950s, strike data shows you that 30% of the workers in manufacturing under large contracts, the contracts expired in 58 and 59 went on strike. And we have never seen that in the period before nor after. Okay. Also at that point in time, you look at interviews with labor leaders. They were talking about how there was some concern that management looks to at least address the cutting down of union power and at most offset challenge to union existence. Just at the time when the truce was supposed to be in operation, the laborers questioned what they ever were. Okay, they didn't lose their existence, absolutely. But things were rougher than this. Now, the data will show that real wages went up and so forth. And the econometrics will show it was a cycle. But you've got to go behind the data. And I would argue that the roots of the non-union labor model were actually laid in the 50s and 60s and 70s. And they came to fruition in the 80s. In the 80s is when this temporary equilibrium between labor and management breaks apart. But it doesn't break apart immediately. The roots are there. You don't see it in the econometrics. You don't see the data. You go behind the data and behind the econometrics. You can see it in strategy. In terms of capital mobility, where firms were expanding, where the new plants were, things like that. And the share of workers unionized begins to drop in the 50s, and you get to the 80s. Okay. Now we're in the 80s. Okay. We're going to talk about declining union density, wage concessions, things like that. The growth of contingent employment, the growth of non-standard employment, the increase in equality in the pay structure, and the decline of the average pay structure. We're running out of time. We can develop that later. The legacy of all this. Okay. The legacy of the Reagan period, the legacy of the collective bargaining in the 80s, the legacy of the increase in non-standard employment, the legacy of the increase in contingent labor. You have a long expansion in the 1990s. It may not have been strong, but it was long. You have unemployment rates going to levels not seen as low since the early 60s, since the late 60s. And wage rates don't increase much. Worker bargaining power doesn't seem to. So what you seem to have is an incomes policy based on fees. How to sum it up? One thing I would like to say is this, that while we tell this story of decline, increased deprivation, declining real wages, I think it's important to remember that not everybody loses in this new neoliberal framework. Not everybody loses. And it is not just the employers who lose. There is a large group of people in the U.S. whose living conditions are actually better now than they were years ago. That has to be remember, when you think about the new labor segmentation, the new class structure in the U.S., everyone has not been in this room. And that discussion really hasn't taken place here. I think I must see it take place. Now, whether this is a new social structure of accumulation or not, that's the part of the paper that wasn't written. And that's what I sort of want to write after I came here. And after the first night here, I figured there's no way to write this one. Because it doesn't require that this is the basis for strong economic growth. Can you have strong economic growth based on this category? Well, some people said you need that for social structure of accumulation. Other people say you don't. Leave that out. What I can say for sure is it's a new institutional framework. That we can say with certainty. Okay. Second, will it lead to rapid economic growth? Has it led to rapid economic growth? It's led to long economic growth. It's led to a stable economy, and that I agree. But it hasn't been that fast, right? So we have a disagreement here. All right. Is it a worse period in terms of certain economic growth measures than the period of regulation? Okay. The data suggests it, but it's the period of regulation, for example, from 48 to 68, 70. Were there events there that led to economic growth that was totally disconnected from the social structure of accumulation analysis? And if those events occurred at that period, don't occur now, perhaps maybe that period, the strong growth there wasn't because of the social structure of accumulation analysis, because of other things. For example, the Korean War, the Vietnam War. They both would probably have an effect on growth. Possibility. All right, and time is up, and one last thing, and